Welcome to the Babblery, working, parenting, playing, voting, advocating, and creating as women. This is your host, Suki Wessling. Those of us in the queer community or allied with the queer community have been suffering what feels like a daily onslaught this year. On top of all the bad news that is a constant in our lives, recent events have included a fire hose of negativity from the political sphere, especially about transgender kids and young adults. I think it's important for people to read the bad news for sure. If we aren't aware of the wrong things that are being done, especially by our elected representatives, how can we fight against them? As much as sometimes I just want to put my fingers into my metaphorical ears and watch the cute baby videos that Meta keeps trying to feed me, I do keep current on news about transgender people who include my family members, friends, and colleagues. Everything that transgender people do at this moment in history is being done against this backdrop of misunderstanding and intolerance. But I am so happy that this particular episode focuses squarely on joy. The joy of fully embracing life to the point that you want to become a parent, even when the act of becoming a parent is deeply transgressive to some of the people around you.
But getting to have all this medical proof that I was in great shape to carry a child made me feel really good about it, and also made me feel like this is a perfectly good body for a baby to come out of. I don't think I'm shortchanging my child by making them come out of me and not someone else. I think I'm actually as capable of this as I always felt I was.
That is Foster, a transmasculine dad who gave birth to his daughter in 2020. Foster was interviewed by my guest, Vann Jones, who now works with the National LGBTQ Task Force. Vann's undergraduate research project culminated in what is probably the first resource of its kind, What to Expect When He's Expecting, a complete guide to transmasculine reproduction.
Hello, my name is Vann. I am a student at UC Santa Cruz. I am a senior currently about to graduate. And over the past 4 years of my education, I've been very interested in the topic of transgender fertility and reproduction, as well as parenthood and all the stuff that kind of comes after.
If there is one quality that most people believe separates women from men, it's pregnancy. Men have become more involved in pregnancy, to be sure, whether they are the biological father, an adoptive father, or a supportive friend. But we share a cultural assumption that pregnancy is the intimate domain of the feminine, and that assumption is now being challenged. As transmasculine folks move from young adulthood to more settled lives, thoughts of family may not be far behind. Transmasculine pregnancy asks us to reconsider pregnancy in the context of gender. As women are winning the fight to take pregnancy and birth back from the dehumanizing system set up in the name of modern medical care, transmasculine people are just beginning to embark on their quest for changes that will make us consider even more deeply the cultural meanings of pregnancy and birth.
The joke that I've always made is, in Portland, if you see a pregnant man at Starbucks, that's maybe not even the weirdest thing you've seen that day.
That's Tristan, another transgender dad interviewed by Vann. Birth stories told by Foster, Gabe, and Tristan were part of Vann's research and can be accessed on his website. Now let's get on to my conversation with Vann, which starts with background information that will help you understand the issues that transgender men who decide to father their biological children face. Here's Vann talking about the genesis of the project when he wrote a paper about transmasculine pregnancy for a writing class.
And my professor was like, "This is absolutely amazing. I've never seen anyone talk about this before. And I think that this is a real talent and a real strength, and you should pursue this further." And so I did. And in my senior year, I was able to come up with my own research project. So it was an official study that was certified by the school. I was able to make a website, right, that housed all of the research that I've done over my 4 years. But I was also able to initiate an oral history project, which was one of the big parts of my research, which was very, very exciting for me. So through my oral history projects, I was able to interview 4 different transgender parents who were able to gestate and carry their own children.
Well, welcome to the Babblery. And I want to say that I'm very excited to be able to share this with the wider world as well. And anyone listening can go to babblery.com and find a link to your resources. And I have to say that it's an extremely thorough site. There's so much great information there. And it's also so informative because, like you said, your professor said, this is not a topic that many people talk about. And I know it's certainly a topic that comes up in families with their teenagers who are transitioning, because there's the early question of how does medically transitioning affect your future fertility? But of course, teenagers are really usually not interested in having babies. We hope, in fact, that they are not interested in having babies. So I wish people could see your face. Vann's like making all these wonderful responses to what I'm saying. So, but it does come up for people later. And so I guess my first question is, do you have any reason that you think you are particularly interested in this topic?
Yeah, 100%. Just a little background about myself. I am a trans man myself. I started transitioning at the age of 15. So I was a trans youth that got to grow up and live to see a trans adulthood, which I am so grateful for. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But when I did start transitioning when I was 15, I went to my endocrinologist, and I feel like a lot of the news and the rhetoric today and a lot of anti-trans sentiment makes it sound like it's such an easy process to get hormones. Like, you go to a doctor, you say, I want to shoot up some testosterone, and they're like, here you go, and you're on your way. That is not how it goes. It takes many, many months. It's a long, long process. And when I was going through all the informed consent, my doctor had told me that if I start testosterone, I would be sterile forever and I would never be able to have my own child.
Oh, but that's not true.
No. So funny enough, it took a year. It took about a year before I actually learned that I was still able to have children, which was very disorienting, right? Like, you go to a doctor, you expect them to be a trusted medical professional that has gone through all the school, all the college, and is supposed to know the stuff, right? And when you find out that your doctor doesn't always know all the stuff, that's a problem. That's really, really troubling, especially when you're a child, right? Because it's like, how am I supposed to know better? I'm 15. You're the adult. You're the doctor. And not having that background information could have potentially put me at risk, right? I didn't have all the knowledge I needed to make safe and informed decisions with my own body. And that's what really started to get me to think, because I've always had a very strong, paternal instinct. I've always really wanted to be a parent. When I was little, I used to play with these little baby dolls all the time, and my grandma would teach me how to take care of babies through the dolls, right? So she bought me a little plastic tub where I learned how to bathe the baby, and she bought little mittens because babies can scratch their faces because they have little dagger nails, right? And so I learned all these things from my grandma, and I was just always so involved with caretaking and roles that people would associate with femininity. But I never saw it that way. I just saw it as being a good person, as being a caretaker, like my grandma was to me. And so I've always had this really strong instinct and desire to have children. I've always loved working with children. I've had many jobs where I've been able to engage and educate and facilitate, all these different programs with children. It's just so much fun. And so when I found out that I couldn't have children, that kind of really changed a lot of things for me, right? In that year before I realized that I could still have babies potentially, I was thinking, okay, well, how am I going to adopt when there's so much discrimination in the adoption field, right? Not a lot of gay parents or trans parents are seen as, a good fit for children. And there's a lot of internal logistics, not even just that, but also if I wanted to somehow go around that and get a surrogate, then I'm going to have to spend money on IVF or all these other complicated things that cost so much more money than people assume or really think about, right? And so just a lot of really mixed feelings came about when I finally realized, oh, I can still have children. Like, this is back on the table for me again. And what I really wanted to do with my research is give all of the information I wish I'd had when I started transitioning to people who are now in this process, who are now thinking about their future and what it's going to be like to be a trans adult and to be a trans parent someday, right? There's all these questions and complications that come to mind. And I just really want people to be as prepared as possible for the world and what's going to come to them.
Yeah. And, you've already said a couple of things that I can assume that is blowing away some of the listeners. Okay. So I'm going to back up and we're going to move slowly into this topic because you said two things that I think were really key that we're going to get to. One is safe and informed decisions, which is so important for all of us because, of course, it doesn't matter whether one person approves of another person, right? What matters is that in our society, we create a society where everybody can make safe and informed decisions, whether or not other people like those decisions, right? So there's that side of the conversation, which we will definitely have. Another thing that you said was the roles associated with femininity. And I really, really want to talk about that too. But first, here's Gabe talking about his view of the roles that men played in his early life.
Knowing friends of mine and knowing other queer people who were parents, and specifically men who were not terrible. Because my experience with my family and in media, also is just that men are terrible parents. It took a while, many, many years, I think, to to see men who weren't bad dads.
I definitely want to move slowly because this issue cuts so deeply into the personal experiences of vulnerable people. So as we'll talk about transmasculine people who become visibly pregnant and have to give birth in with professionals who are most likely not used to birth experiences with transgender people. They're very vulnerable. But on the other side, it also excites a lot of negative emotions in people who may feel that their beliefs about sex, gender, womanhood, and motherhood are all being threatened, right? So my goal here, and I know yours is as well, to create more understanding. So to that end, I want to have a brief conversation, and those of you who know all of what we're about to say can stick with us because we will get to the meaty stuff next, but a brief conversation about some definitions, because it's really important that people understand what we're talking about. So first, let's just go through the sort of basic gender definitions: transgender, cisgender, and the word you're using, transmasculine, and a lot of people might not be used to that. Can you talk about what those mean?
So cisgender is like the somewhat default, right? That's what a lot of our society considers like the default to be. So you are born, the doctor pulls you out of your mother or your parent and they say, it's a boy, it's a girl, whatever. And then you live your life as that, right? So it's what most people would live as if they were not transgender, right? So kind of like the opposite in some ways. So a cisgender person is born, they're identified as a certain sex, and they continue to live as that sex and gender for the duration of their life. Whereas a transgender person is born, we're lifted out of the womb and we are said, oh, this is a boy, this is a girl, whatever. Maybe not. Maybe that's not it, right? And so a transgender person doesn't just necessarily mean someone who is on like a binary scale. Like it's not just like a man who becomes a woman or a woman who becomes a man, that kind of a thing. But it refers to more of like a umbrella term. Like it's more of like a general category. And that refers to non-binary people. It refers to people who, you know, have very different experiences and concepts of gender and how they relate to it, right? And so it's just something that's kind of, and I think it comes back to the root trans, right? Like trans, to transport, to transition, to all these different things, to move, right? So it's a movement from one state to another in terms of your gender. So the reason in terms of transmasculine, why I chose transmasculine over trans man, is because it's a little more broad as a category. And I wanted to try to encapsulate as many people's experiences as possible within this research, right? Because when we think about these things, when we think about gender and we think about pregnancy, there's so much variety in the human experience, the individual human experience, right? So many people have very different, traits, expressions, and just because someone doesn't fall within the binary doesn't mean that they're not still experiencing these very specific and discriminatory things, right? So, I mean, for example, some people can feel like they're more non-binary, but not necessarily a man, but they might still feel a little more masculine. They might transition, they might do testosterone, and they might kind of come into more of what they would consider a transmasculine identity. That, or even some people who are intersex, right? So people who are born with multiple sexual characteristics could still take testosterone or can still even just see themselves as more masculine. You don't even need to necessarily take hormones to feel more internally masculine.
It would go too far afield for us to explore all the research, so Vann suggested that I add a summary explanation here. Despite what you might have read in the popular press, research demonstrates that sex and gender are not and have never been a simple binary. Intersex people, whose reproductive organs may show both male and female attributes, are a natural variation in human biology. Studies of hormones, brain chemistry, and brain structures show a complexity that does not support two distinct genders. And historically, many cultures have had more than two gender categories, but that doesn't mean it isn't confusing for people to grasp the difference between sex, gender, and sexual preference.
For so long, there's been this big conflation of gender and sexuality, right? Like, historically, it's actually really difficult to find traces of trans people because they were so often categorized as just gay, right? So if you displayed any kind of non-gender normative trait, like if you were a more feminine man per se, right? You would just be thought of as gay. That wasn't even a question that you were trans, right? Because the language didn't even exist until around the late 90s. That's when it really became really accepted by the community.
And finally, I think this is perhaps the most contentious one because it's the most recent. The usage of pregnant people rather than pregnant women, even though women, cisgender women who are identified female at birth, are the most common people to become pregnant and have babies. So why the use of pregnant people instead of pregnant women?
There's nothing necessarily wrong with the word pregnant women when you're referring to women who are pregnant, right? But if we're just talking more broadly about people in general who are able to gestate, who are able to carry a child, and talking about the issues surrounding that, right? Especially right now, most importantly, abortion is one of the biggest issues that is facing people who have the potential to become pregnant, right? Because if you don't have access to abortion, you don't have control over your own body. And when we're talking about issues that are broader and more applicable to everyone who can become pregnant, right? Because of course it's like, okay, if we're going to take a study of pregnant women and talk about pregnant women's experience, there's nothing wrong with saying pregnant women if we're talking about pregnant women. But if we're talking about just the general spectrum of people who can become pregnant, it is best to use more inclusive language because it makes their experiences real and visible to people, right? When we say pregnant women, we're excluding all of these people outside of cisgender women who are able to carry pregnancies, who do experience these really real and important issues, and we need to include them in the conversation, right? Because there are so many intersex, trans, all these different people who are now also affected by this abortion rights bill. And especially even more so because we're already at such a disadvantage in feeling so uncomfortable going to these clinics because they're such highly gendered spaces in the first place. It's so hard for trans people to access abortion and access their reproductive care, even to start with, that when we're adding these extra barriers involved, it becomes a lot more complicated. And for example, one of the things that I did in my research is I went through a ton of different abortion funds from states where it's now likely or more likely to become illegal. And I found specific abortion funds that use gender neutral language or are more trans inclusive. And I made a collective list of that so that when people are going to access these resources, they know which ones they're going to feel comfortable with. And they're not going to feel like they're being misgendered or like they break down with a dysphoric episode because they just feel like so horrible about their bodily experience being associated with femininity, right? So it's important to be considering these people and including them in language when it's talking about their broader rights and access, because that's not something that's just for cisgender women. It's for everyone who can be pregnant.
We have been speaking about transmasculine pregnancy, exploring definitions and the reasons for those definitions. Visit Babblery.com to find a link to Vann's research. When the Babblery returns, we'll talk about the way that trans parents experience our healthcare system. Welcome back to the Babblery. We are speaking with researcher Vann Jones about transmasculine pregnancy. Here's Tristan, one of the transmasculine dads that Vann interviewed for his research. As happens in many birth stories, Tristan's well-laid plans fell apart at the last minute when he found he would have to be cared for by a medical team he hadn't met. For a trans person giving birth, a last-minute change is not a simple matter.
Called the head nurse at the labor and delivery department and just told them, like, hey, I'm going to be in your hospital in an hour to be induced. I'm a transgender man. I really want to put you in charge of making sure that everyone that comes into my room treats me respectfully. Is that something that you can do? And she was like, yes, we had a transgender staff member a couple of years ago. And like, I know exactly which midwife to assign to you. She's the woman that helped me when I was giving birth. So yeah, she was really good about that.
Vann and I wanted to make sure that we clarify some facts about medical transition options for transmasculine people so listeners understand the range of choices that transmasculine people make. The term medical transition refers to using hormones or surgery to change sex-linked characteristics of the body. For some transgender people, fitting in with others of their gender helps mitigate gender dysphoria, the sense of unease when one's gender doesn't match one's external appearance. Testosterone is the hormone that stimulates development of male secondary sex characteristics. Transmasculine people may use testosterone, often referred to as T, to develop a deeper voice, facial hair, and other typically masculine physical features. There are many ways to take testosterone, but the most common method is by injection. Vann points out that there isn't one standard option that transgender people choose when transitioning.
It's very individual in people's decisions whether or not they want to access medical transition. Sometimes it just isn't the kind of goal that they have for their body, right? Like the way that it looks already feels comfortable to them. They don't feel like they need anything additional or different. And another big thing that people don't really realize is there is a really difficult, financial aspect to it, right? Like not everyone can afford to medically transition, especially surgeries, because many insurance companies don't cover transition-related surgeries because they see it as elective, right? It's not medically necessary, so they won't cover it. And so then people have to start paying out of their own pocket, and that's tens of thousands of dollars. And then you have to consider not even just that, but the after of the surgery, right? Like once you're done with the surgery, now you have to recover. And what about all that time you have to take off from work, right? It's a very intensive, money intensive, especially process. It takes lots of time and takes a lot of dedication, and it can take even years to schedule a surgery. And sometimes doctors don't even want you to have a surgery if you're not on testosterone beforehand, right? So there's so many complicating issues in terms of access and even the desire to have medical transition. There are a lot of trans people who are now saying, why should I even have to transition? I can feel internally about myself a certain way. And that doesn't mean I need to present that way to the whole public, right? Like not everyone has to see me the way I see me, which is like a very important conversation to have, right? Because no one should have to do hormones if they don't want to. If you want to, go for it. But if you don't, you don't, right? And that doesn't make you any less trans. There's a lot of gatekeeping, especially within the community, even about medical transition and how it makes you legitimate or illegitimate as a trans person. But generally, of course, not everyone wants to or can.
Transmasculine people might choose one of a few types of surgery during their medical transition. The most common is top surgery, breast reduction that can be performed using one of a variety of different procedures. Bottom surgery is a masculinizing procedure that is currently less commonly performed. Amongst Vann's interviewees, who are adult transmasculine people, 3 had medically transitioned and 1 had not. But all of them faced decisions that shed light on the complexity of pregnancy and birth care in the United States. Here's Foster talking about navigating pregnancy leave when your legal gender is male.
The big thing for me that was like a very concrete problem was actually to do with the company I was working for at the time. They have like a third party that manages all our benefits. And that third party, I had called multiple times during my pregnancy and said like, hey, I'm just checking about my maternity leave and like making sure that's all okay and making sure I do it properly so that I don't mess anything up. So everything was good. They were like, and they explained to me exactly how to do that. And then I got my pay when I went on parental leave. And then I got a notice saying, hey, if you don't respond by this date that already passed, we're going to take you to collections because we overpaid you thousands of dollars that you owe us back. And I was like, that sounds like probably exactly the amount that I got paid in parental leave. What's up with that? So I called and they were like, well, it says here that you're a man. So we denied the whole claim.
What you have really focused on is adults, transgender adults, transmasculine adults who decide that in one way or another, they want to have children. And you already mentioned the difficulty of adoption. So we're not even going to start with adoption because the fact is that adoption is difficult for straight, middle-class, well-off parents who've never been divorced, who own their own home, etc. It's a hard process. And when you start adding things in, it gets harder and harder. So we're talking about a few options. And what are those options in general?
Yeah. So, of course, the primary way, it's often referred to as the old-fashioned way, right? The do-it-yourself way. So if you have I'll just say from the example of like a transmasculine person that wants to have a child. If you have a sperm-producing partner, right, doesn't just mean a cisgender man. It could also be a feminine, transfeminine person, someone who's taken estrogen even, sometimes can still produce sperm. So any person who's able to produce sperm, you could just do it yourself, old-fashioned way, have your own child. And that's not, of course, medically invasive or cost-intensive, unless, of course, you do have fertility issues and you need to seek treatment. But for the most part, there is good data that shows that when trans men get off of testosterone, there is no problem in actually becoming pregnant.
This is Gabe, who medically transitioned long before he decided to get pregnant. In the interview, he refers to T, which is another word for testosterone.
I've been what I would consider fully transitioned for probably about 15 years and was on T for most of that time. When we started trying for a baby, I was off T probably for about a year. And once my cycle came back, we started trying for a baby, which took about 6 months.
So when trans men start taking testosterone, what happens to their menstrual cycle?
So the reason I feel like a lot of people for so long thought that trans people were infertile was because our menstruation cycle does stop. So testosterone stops the cycle. And so every month when your egg would naturally drop and you would have a period, when it drops, it just becomes reabsorbed into the body. So it doesn't actually induce menstruation. You don't have your period anymore, but the egg does still exist and it does still drop. And so that is a point when it is possible for you to become pregnant, right? Not necessarily, because testosterone thins the uterine wall. So what that does is it makes it really hard for a fertilized egg to implant. And so if it can't implant, then it just falls right out. It doesn't fertilize. It doesn't get to grow and become a fetus. So for the most part, when people are on testosterone and their uterine lining is thinned, it is more difficult for them to become pregnant. And some people have actually been able to use it as quote unquote birth control for up to 10 years, right? Like some people.
Let's interject here in case there's a young trans person listening to this, that this is not a good method of birth control.
The main concern, though, is that if you are on testosterone while pregnant, it is teratogenic to the fetus, which means it causes developmental defects. And so it is not safe for the fetus for you to be on testosterone during that time. And typically, a lot of people who do accidentally become pregnant while on testosterone will miscarry. Most people who do become pregnant while on testosterone kind of admit to having skipped doses or missed doses or were on lower doses of testosterone while it happened. And so it is a lot more likely, especially for children who don't always remember to take their testosterone, right? That's like a big population. I remember when I was 16, I forgot sometimes. That's not the first thing on your head all the time. And so it is important, especially for younger people, to seek birth control. And not even just for younger people, but for everyone, because it's also not a preventative of STIs, right?
Mhm.
Like you should still use protection just generally for other reasons besides pregnancy. But it is kind of good for people to know that you will likely miscarry if you're on testosterone.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so when a person who wants to get pregnant stops taking the testosterone, or say they might be a transgender person who chose not to use hormones, then their cycle starts up again and they have some options. And you have your oral histories on your website, and I really hope that people listening who want to get more information listen to those. They're fascinating, and I can't stress enough how thankful the world should be that these four men were willing to talk to you in such depth and detail, and they made different decisions. Your four people that you did the oral histories with made different decisions for different reasons. So can you talk about what those decisions might be and what those reasons might be? And you could, even refer to the people that you interviewed.
Yeah, for sure. So I believe most people who I interviewed did do it the old-fashioned way, right? Like, so they had sperm-producing partners that they were able to get pregnant with. There was one person who did not. His name is Steph. And Steph is a really interesting case because he actually went through the process of IVF to have his child. So at the time, he was with his partner, and they were both female presenting at the time. Or he says he was never feminine, right? Like he always like felt himself to be more masculine, but he had not transitioned or really found like the courage to go through that process at the time, right? And so Steph was with his partner. They identified as lesbians at the time, and they went through a process of co-IVF, right? So just regular straight on IVF, in vitro fertilization. It is the process in which they take your eggs and some sperm, and in a lab, they will fertilize, they will combine the two and fertilize it to make a zygote before implanting it in the uterus, right? And that's, a lot of people do that for various reasons, for fertility treatment, for all kinds of things. It's a very expensive process, and it's often not covered by insurance, which is really, really, it's a big issue. We won't get too much into that right now, but so IVF is very straightforward in the sense it's like one egg, one sperm, and you make a thing, right? But for co-IVF, the process is a little different. So they took Steph's eggs, right? And then they used donor sperm. So it's biologically related to Steph, right? The child is Steph's child, but it's being gestated within his partner, who is not biologically related to the child, okay? And so this process is called as co-IVF, or as my good friend Tristan Reese likes to call it, my bun, your oven, which I think is a really good phrase. And so the reason why they chose to do that was because Steph didn't feel comfortable in carrying a pregnancy, but he still really wanted a child, of course. And because at the time they didn't let two female-bodied people have names on birth certificates, he was not able to be written down as his child's parent on the birth certificate.
I just keep going back to your wonderful phrase, safe and informed decisions. That when we allow these things, we're not as a society saying, yes, this is great. We're as a society saying everyone needs protection under the law. Everyone needs to be able to have legal connections to their children and that sort of thing. So, and then obviously the most common, from what you said, the most common situation is that the transmasculine person who wants to be a father will go off testosterone and become pregnant, either if they have a sperm producing partner, then they do it the old fashioned way. And if they don't, they do the turkey baster or something like it. So in the case of someone like Steph, they're choosing not to carry a pregnancy for a few reasons, one being the legal reason that we discussed, but also the strong association of pregnancy with femininity. And can you talk a little bit about that?
It's very obvious that the way that we, regulate and control women, especially in terms of pregnancy, is because it's seen as the most feminine thing, right? So it's, of course, the most scrutinized. And so many people have talked about this experience, not even just trans men, but cisgender women talk about how they feel like there is so much scrutiny involved with their decisions, right? Like if you don't breastfeed, you're a terrible mother. You're going to give your child autism with the formula, right? Like there's like so many like lies and misconceptions about, people and what's the best way to raise your child. What's the best way to give birth? If you have an epidural, you're a bad parent because you're pumping your body full of chemicals, right? Like there's so many decisions that are just so heavily judged, and people feel so much shame in their choices as a mother, as a parent, just so many things that people have to grapple with. And those aren't lost to transmasculine people, right? They still feel all of this shame, all of this judgment from the people around them who are telling them what they can and can't or should and shouldn't do with their bodies.
Everything that trans men go through in order to bring babies into this world is the same, yet different. Case in point, here's Tristan talking about his experience with being a visibly pregnant man.
When they would come down to visit, it was just so sweet. A lot of people talk about how they're like, oh my God, do not touch my pregnant belly, But I think because I'm a man, and maybe because I have more people in my life who are cool, like nobody did, you know what I mean? Because they were like, oh, I know that's offensive or whatever. But my dad was so lovely. I remember he came to visit and like he would give me a hug and then he would touch my belly. And because he's a doctor, he'd be like, okay, so there's an elbow right there. I can feel it. It was really sweet. It just never occurred to him that it would be, I don't know, that my pregnancy would be any different than any of his other kids.
Let's return now to Vann talking about the experience of being a pregnant man and also how transmasculine pregnancy highlights how gendered pregnancy and birth spaces can be.
There are varying ranges of dysphoria, the way that people actually interpret their own bodies as masculine or feminine, right? And a lot of people don't necessarily see pregnancy as incongruent with their masculinity, right? Like they can include a masculine pregnant experience within their own identity, and it doesn't bother them, right? But it's more about the way that society sees us or treats us based off of the ways that they see us that really do bother us. And so primarily, of course, I feel like the heavily gendered language that is used is one of the biggest things, especially going into clinic spaces. There's usually a lot of hyper gendered materials, either, decorations on the wall or reading materials. There have been some trans men that have cited going to a clinic only to find out that they only have a woman's bathroom in the institution. And it's like, when you're pregnant, you have to pee every 30 minutes, right?
Yeah, and I mean, men have to pee too. Okay, come on. That's crazy.
Yeah. And, even for people that are bringing their male partners with them to the clinic, it's like, why would you only have a women's rep? Anyway.
And on top of that, I can tell you that there's a language thing. You lose your name in a lot of situations, healthcare situations. When you're pregnant, you become mom. They just a nurse will say, Mom, could you come over here? And, and you just become mom. And that's a little strange, especially if you're planning to be dad. You're listening to the Babblery. We'll return with more discussion about transmasculine pregnancy and how trans men's birth experiences shed light on our societal views of women. Welcome back to the Babblery. I'm your host, Suki Wessling, speaking with Vann Jones about transmasculine pregnancy. The Babblery is a podcast about women's lives, and trans men are not women. But as I spoke with Vann about the experiences of trans pregnancy, I kept reflecting on how it's like a mirror that is being held up to the culture we have built around pregnancy and motherhood. Here's Foster.
I get that they can't learn everybody's names, so they abbreviate by saying mom and dad. And right after pregnancy, I did not look like a man. Like, I was not cis passing. And so I was very much gendered. And then like maybe a week or two into her stay at the NICU, one nurse kind of picked up on it and was like, "What are your pronouns?" I was like, "Hey, thank you."
It kind of dehumanizes the people experiencing the pregnancy. And I know that, like, of course, there should and always has been a lot of focus on the baby, but it's also like, what about like the person carrying the child? I feel like so often they get lost within the conversation, or their needs are seen as secondary to the baby. And that's not good either, right? That's also like an aspect of like sexism and like associating women with more of their bodies rather than who they are as people. And that goes again for trans people as well, right? Like, we don't want to be like dwindled down to only our relationship to our child. We're an individual person with our own feelings and experiences.
Can you describe some of the things that you were told in the oral history gathering and what you've seen as far as people being able to get respectful healthcare?
Just like the ways that we refer to patients, especially within health settings. They need to ask questions. They need to, be a little more, I think, human, I guess, in their like, you're not just treating like a rat in a lab. This is a person that you're talking to and giving care to. And so it's really important that like providers are kind of trained with a background in gender knowledge, especially in places that are considered women's healthcare, like gynecologists or like fertility clinics, right? I think it's really important that these people, especially in highly gendered situations, need to have more understanding and background. And so I think that like being very direct with your care providers and having these conversations ahead of time, making that phone call, even having a friend or an ally make that phone call for you on your behalf if you're not feeling comfortable or up to it, is just like a world of difference in the actual treatment and care that you receive. Mm-hmm. So I think that not only do care workers need to step up their game and do a little more educating for themselves, but I think that allies and the people experiencing pregnancy and seeking these resources need to stand up and make sure that they are being treated accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what you describe is something that's going to be very familiar to anyone who's had experiences where their child or they are an outlier in any way. We need to advocate for ourselves. But that brings up the question, of putting the responsibility of advocacy on the very people who suffer the most discrimination and potential abuse, which is hard.
It is very difficult. I feel like that's especially why it should be put on the care provider and allies around us, friends around us, for that labor to be offset and not put on the person. But obviously, that's not always the reality, right? Yeah. We don't always have people in our lives to do that for us. We don't always have great care providers who don't even need to be told to use our pronouns. And that's just the real experience that we have. Mm-hmm. And we're just trying to make the best with what we have. And that's honestly why I feel like it's very important to recognize how many people go towards at-home births within the trans community, within many marginalized communities, because they don't feel comfortable with institutional settings of healthcare, because they've had so many bad experiences throughout their lives with receiving accurate and adequate care.
Here's Tristan again.
Sometimes, even if someone gives birth, they're able to put themselves down as a father, and if their wife is the mother. But sometimes the hospitals are weird about it. Other times it's not possible. It completely depends on the state. Sometimes it depends on the literal midwife who's like signing the birth certificate, or the OBGYN if you had a surgical birth. It seems pretty random in a lot of ways.
That brings me into how we can make the process of pregnancy and birth better for everyone. The idea of questioning what our assumptions are and what our beliefs that might be harmful are. When it comes to this question of transmasculine pregnancy causing some big discomfort on the part of people such as midwives, people who have spent their lives advocating for women, knowing what happens to women because of misogyny. There are some very vocal women who are uncomfortable with being asked to embrace transmasculine pregnancy and to open up their language and their expectations. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I think it's really relevant and valid, especially in today's climate, right? Where we're seeing so much push and so much just the ways that so many groups have been targeted and their rights have been targeted and stripped away. There's so much more control and domination in play that we really haven't seen in prior years. And I think it's really important to talk about like the ways that all these issues do kind of come together, and they do kind of shape and inform one another, right? So for example, talking about just generally trans existence, trans people and intersex people, and what that kind of says about the binary, right? Because I feel like we are especially at very interesting positions within our society to look at the ways that we have structured, especially gender, into this dichotomy, right? Where it's considered to be, two very opposing things, right? Like they're not meant to go together. They are meant to be in opposition of one another. And that's a lot of the ways that we have, understood patriarchy, right? It came from this opposition, right? Where masculinity and femininity are different and opposing, but it's also kind of structural in terms of a hierarchy, right? One is better than the other, right? And that's where a lot of this patriarchy comes from, is these assumptions that masculinity is better than femininity. And I think that really, like I was saying, though, that trans and intersex people in particular are so interesting because we sit at this position where we're able to see this binary, and just through our own lived experiences, we're able to say, but that's not right. But that's not true. Like, there is no binary, especially like considering intersex people, right? Like there are, I believe, I do have a number. It's 0.5 to 1.7% of the population are intersex people, right? And so that's a pretty decent number of people. That's about the same number of trans people that there are in the United States, about 0.5 to 1.7-ish, right? And so when we think about this somewhat minor group of people, right, in the grand scheme of things, that really topple all of these assumptions that we have made for so long, this binary that we've upheld and considered to be natural. And we can just say, but it's not. But it's not. There is no decrease in like their life expectations or their ability to be successful or happy, but they are still operated on because they want them to be just swept into the rest of this dichotomy that we've created.
Yeah, this binary that we believe in. And for parents, especially say cisgender heterosexual parents who are told, when the baby comes out, congratulations, you have we're not sure. This brings up the whole question of whether all of this thinking that has been done that has used words like patriarchy and feminism sort of missed something big, which is that the problem here, it seems to me, might be power imbalances and assumptions based on external cues. Because as we've noticed in modern times, when you put women in position of power over other people, sometimes they don't behave at all in what we would consider to be a feminine, we have these ideas that women are more likely to be collaborative, which, by numbers is true. But when you take a single woman and you put her in a position of power over other people, that doesn't mean she's going to behave that way, because power and assumptions, as you mentioned, seem to be really at the root of what we're talking about.
Especially like when talking about like these things about assumptions, right? A lot of the times can be boiled down to biologic essentialism, right? And this is a lot of things we talk about within trans contexts of like, we are not just our bodies, right? We are more than our bodies. Our gender does not have to be based within our quote unquote sex, right? And especially like when we're thinking about women's issues at large, that's one way that we can really use transgender experience to inform women's experience, because a lot of these assumptions about a woman's place or a woman's role within society comes from a biological essentialism, right? It's saying that women are naturally inclined to be certain ways, which we can just honestly just prove that it's not true, especially like when we talk about issues of like transgender athletes and people who are intersex. There are so many people who fall within cisgender categories, right? People who are born as women, who have typical attributes that people would associate with women, who still just have higher levels of testosterone naturally, right? Or whose bodies are different. Some women are tall, some women are muscular, and they're still cisgender. And people can't handle that or like understand that. And I think it really just goes to show like how ridiculous the binary is and how all these assumptions about nature, when a lot of these, anti-trans figureheads are talking about like biology and nature, it's very obvious that they haven't taken a biology class before, because even like chromosomes vary so much. People have XXY chromosomes, people have XXX chromosomes, people have all kinds of crazy stuff going on with our bodies. Our bodies are so beautiful and amazing and wonderful, crazy things, and they are so beyond categories and these limitations. Okay, so some people, a majority of people might experience certain things, but we should not use that to say every single individual person has to look or dress or do the same things. Some of my research that I performed, and I actually made a short video about that I think is really interesting and really important in terms of what cisgender people and everyone in general can take from a transmasculine pregnancy experience, is that dads need to be more hands-on. Like that is like one of like the most important things, one of the biggest potentials that I think comes from transmasculine parenthood, is that in our society for so long, fathers have been seen not as directly in relation to their children, but more through a mediated tie through their relationship with their wife, right? So the child is connected to the wife and the dad is connected through the child through the wife, right? There's not a direct connection between the father and the child. And so much of the caretaking and the responsibility of like the emotional labor falls onto the woman, and it's like completely just like disregarded from a male's experience. And that's super bad for men. Men should have relationships with their children. There's so much emotional growth and just like the connection and the feeling that you get from having this direct relationship with a child that is so valuable in not only just like society, but in individual people's lives. It increases their quality of life and their happiness to have this direct relationship. And I know so many fathers who wish that they had better relationships with their children. And I think that by seeing transmasculine parents, right, who are in this role of being able to be the birthing parent and having that birth connection, really goes to show that you don't have to just be a woman to be a caretaker. You don't have to just be a woman to love your child and to spend time with your child and do all these things, right? And that men need to step up. Men need to be more involved. Like, we cannot expect women to take care of every single person in our society, right? Like, this has to be a joint effort between men and women to be the emotional caretakers that we need, because we need more emotionally healthy people, period, right? Mm-hmm. That's the only way to come out of all of this negativity and all of these terrible things that are happening in our society. We need to have more empathy for others. We need to have more emotional connections. We need to build these relationships. And I think that being able to see that, it is possible for men, people who do have big old beards like mine and like all these things that we so heavily associate with masculinity, be tender and be emotional and be, paternal, right? I think we need to reinvent what being paternal means. And I think that that's probably the overall most important thing that we can take from a transgender experience is maybe people don't have to necessarily be transgender, but you don't have to be trapped by the role that society has given you. You don't have to be defined by your genitals. You are a person outside of your body. You have a brain, you have a heart, you have all these things, and you can make your own decisions. And I'm not going to stop you based off of some dumb notion that people with boobs have to do some specific thing in their lives, right? Like, it's just ridiculous.
When I first approached Vann about coming on the Babblery, I was afraid he'd just brush me off. Speak about transmasculine pregnancy on a podcast about women's lives? Why would I do that? But one of the things that I think all of us can get from the widening of gender norms is a new perspective on ourselves and our own lives, our assumptions and our biases. Vann and I ended our conversation talking about the literal thing that contains each and every one of us, our bodies. Women walk through the world as women, visibly the other and usually unable to escape that. But women also find that being the other, being in our bodies, doesn't just bring problems. It also brings perspective and joy that we experience uniquely from others. Transmasculine people's pregnancies ask us to open ourselves even further. We are asked to embrace a world in which parents are people first, people who through accident or by design choose to nurture humanity's young. This is one job where we can't bring ourselves without bringing our bodies. Unlike cisgender women, transgender people don't have the privilege to approach pregnancy and birth without facing the presence of their bodies within a system not set up for them. We can't escape our bodies, but as Vann points out, transgender people teach us valuable lessons about what our bodies can do.
And we were talking about the internet. I said, yeah, I had to leave social media because I was kind of public for a minute. And she's like, oh, like, what were you public for? And I said, oh, like, I'm transgender and I was pregnant with Leo. I gave birth to him. And she was like, oh, you were pregnant, you gave birth to Leo. I said, yeah. And she said, thank God, now we can talk about pregnancy together.
Just seeing them figure stuff out. I feel super privileged that like I'm in a relationship and we're happy to be part of it equally, and that we can both see there's features from both of us in the baby, which is something that like I never thought was important before, and I still don't think it's important. I'm more happy about it than I realized I would be, because like I'm happy to see like pieces of the person I love in their face and vice versa.
There's this feeling that there's no future for you, that you'll never have a normal life, that you'll never be happy, that you'll never have the things that really make people fulfilled. So much of that comes from these ideas about being able to have children and being able to have a family, like being able to find a loving partner who cares about you and having stability. In a lot of ways, we're a pretty vanilla family. And I think that trans kids seeing that could be really healing. So sometimes it will be a little out of our comfort zone, but we want to share it. We think it's important.
Thanks to Vann for his advocacy and openness, and to Tristan, Gabe, and Foster for sharing their perspectives. You've been listening to the Babblery, working, parenting, playing, voting, advocating, and creating as women. Visit Babblery.com for links and information about this podcast. The Babblery is produced with support from KSQD in Santa Cruz, California.